Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 15, the letter he wrote to the Corinthian church, that if the resurrection is not true, we are to be pitied for a couple of reasons. Number one, there is no real hope of resurrection for ourselves, of being brought back from the dead for ourselves, if the resurrection of Jesus is not true. Number two, we've been lied to. If the claims about the resurrection in the New Testament are false, the writers then have lied, and we have, unfortunately, if we believe this nonsense, have believed the lie, and we are to be pitied. Now, when I first read that, that was interesting to me as a guy who was not a Christian. As a guy who was a skeptic, I thought to myself, this is interesting, because here is a guy who is doubling down on the claim, really, in the first century. Has a sense that, people are going to be skeptical when they first read this, when they first hear this. That's clear to Paul. And he doubles down on the claim here by saying, hey, we're not lying to you. And if we are lying to you, you've been duped, and this would be he recognizes this would be a bad thing. He actually calls it out for what people might suspect it to be, a lie, and then doubles down on the claim. So I thought this is interesting. It's worth us, I think, examining the claims of the resurrection, especially on Easter season. But really, if we're interested in truly examining the Christian worldview to see if it is true, we ought to look at this first key piece of evidence. And so today's show is really going to be all about whether or not you should even believe this claim, and why some folks who don't believe it continue to resist it. So I want to talk about why some skeptics continue to resist the claim of the resurrection, what it is that's standing in their way, and I'm going to talk to you about it from my own experience. Now look, I know there's a danger in doing that for a couple of reasons. There's a danger in doing it because you don't want to extrapolate from your own personal experience and think that's true for every other skeptic in the world. So I'm going to speak now in from two kind of points of reference. One is my own personal point of reference as a guy who was an atheist until I was 35 and was looking at this claim. This claim of the resurrection was foundational to me personally. I needed to know if it was true, and I had some resistance to it, and I will examine that in a minute. So that's the first thing, my own personal point of reference. Also, I can tell you, though, as somebody who has now been speaking on this topic for years around the country to hundreds of audiences and probably about 100,000 people so far, I can tell you that I do hear a lot of the same kinds of objections related to the resurrection that I held for many years. So while this is my personal objection years ago, I do think it probably represents a large number of skeptics who continue to resist the claims of Christianity. I think this we're going to talk about today is the real reason why, a key reason why people still resist this. Now, I also want to share with you a little bit of my own journey so to make some context for this, so it makes some sense for this. And that is basically this. I was a guy who was really not interested in Christianity. As a matter of fact, the Christians I did know didn't seem to be able to represent their worldview very well. I either had believers who were officers who weren't really able to make a case for why Christianity was true, in spite of the fact they could make a case for why a particular suspect was the guy involved in a robbery series, for example. So they have a very kind of sequential, evidential approach to their professional work, and then when it came to their claims about Christianity, they would, really kind of say, well, this is one of those things you just have to believe. Well, that wasn't going to work for me as somebody who I just didn't understand why anyone who would take one kind of approach to everything else in their life would not then take the same kind of approach to the most important things in their life. So I just could not jump in with the kind of certainty that these folks seem to possess. The other thing, of course, I encountered were Christians who I would arrest. And these folks would claim to be Christians, but their behavior didn't seem to be all that much better than the other people who weren't Christians who I arrested. So I had a real problem not seeing what I thought was if this is the kinds of people who are involved in this worldview, I just didn't have any interest in it. So that was part of it. And so when I first sat down with my wife, and she had been trying to get me to go to church for a number of years, not because she was somebody who was herself a believer, because I think we would both say that we got saved at the same time. But she was far more interested than I was. And she at least had people in her family that she knew that kind of modeled this. And I didn't have that. So I just was a little bit different position than she was in. So when we first went to an evangelical church, and I heard the preacher talk about Jesus in a way that intrigued me, that I never thought you could talk about Jesus as just a really smart guy whose wisdom was so profound that it shaped all of Western civilization. And I thought, well, that's Is that even true? That's a claim that I would want to examine to see if it was true. I think I would have been interested, right, in the kind of person that Jesus was, because I'd want to know what kind of a person really has that kind of wisdom. What's the wisdom we're talking about that we say shapes all of Western culture? So I was interested in the person of Jesus for those narrow reasons, not because I was interested in God's existence, or even interested in whether or not Jesus was God. As a matter of fact, I would have rejected all of that for reasons we'll talk about in a minute. I was simply interested in whether or not there was wisdom from Jesus that I could glean to benefit from in my own personal life. And that's why I bought my first Pew Bible. I didn't spend a lot of money on this. I probably spent $6 to purchase that Bible. It was the kind of Bible you would typically see in the back of pews in churches. So it was the kind of thing that I felt like I could afford, and one Bible was as good as another. I had no idea what translation to buy, any of that. So I went out and bought a Bible. And I started to read through it just to get the wisdom statements of Jesus off the pages of the New Testament. My problem was, of course, that I started to see things on the pages of the New Testament because these wisdom statements are couched in Gospels. Gospels that seem to want us to believe that they actually include eyewitness observations of this guy named Jesus of Nazareth. People who were there and knew enough to see this, write it down, preserve it. If they did speak about it for some season before writing it down, that didn't bother me, because as a cold case detective, I already knew, as a detective back then anyway, I knew that that's often the case where you don't get to a witness until some period of time has gone by. And in some of my cases, there's 30 years have gone by before I can find a witness, and I'm supposed to trust that he's telling me something that's important, that's true about an event that occurred 30 years ago. I think you can actually hold on to those kinds of memories if the memories are of key events that are unique and powerful in the context of the observer's life. And that's certainly what these would have been. So I started to read through these eyewitness accounts and try to assess them to see how much of them I could trust. And of course, there's all kinds of miracles in these accounts. I just would skip over those because I didn't believe you could trust those. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And then I finally came to the biggest miracle of all, which is the resurrection of Jesus. So look, I at some point would have gotten to a place where I would have said that these accounts displayed some truth, some historical truth even, to an extent. But I would have said they certainly couldn't be true related to any of the miracles in those accounts. My perspective as an atheist was that I rejected the claims of the miraculous. So I was a committed philosophical naturalist in that sense. I did not believe that the supernatural existed, was reasonable. Didn't think it was reasonable. And so I would have said that the historical accounts we see in the Gospels are some form of historical fiction, in which there are key pieces of the account that are rooted in history to convince us of something, yet there are other pieces of the account that are entirely fictional. And I would have always said the pieces that are fictional are those places in the account where Jesus either heals somebody, works a miracle, feeds 5,000, 4,000, whatever the case may be, and certainly him rising from the dead and ascending into heaven. These are the supernatural elements of first century writing, which you see in other forms of ancient text also, that I would have said were the insertions, the things that can't be true, because of my position as a philosophical naturalist. Look, you can't insert the supernatural into history and still call it history. If you're going to do that, you now have stepped out of a genre we call history, and you're now in a genre we would call mythology. So we can't be doing that. We also can't step out of the natural sciences and try to jam in supernatural explanations. I would have said you stepped out of science the minute you did that. So this is where I stood for a long time. And as I read through the accounts of the Gospels, I did realize that, wow, except for the miracles, these things pass the test. In all the ways that I would apply what I knew for reliability in eyewitnesses as a detective, the four things I looked for: were they really there? Can they be corroborated in some way? I don't expect full corroboration, because you never get an eyewitness who's fully corroborated. You get what I call touch point corroboration. So are these Gospels at least corroborated in a touch point sense? They are. And third, do we think they've been transmitted to us? Do you think this guy's ever changed his story? Because if a witness changes his story over time, you can't trust him. And so I needed to test the Gospels to see if they'd ever changed their story about Jesus over time. And the fourth thing, of course, is bias. Do you have, do the writers of these accounts have so much skin in the game that they are willing to lie because they are trying to give themselves some kind of advantage? And of course, advantage is driven by only three motives. A desire to do something wrong, like lie, is only driven by three motives. The same three motives that drive all homicides: money, sex, relationships, and power. These are the three things that motivate anyone to do something they shouldn't do. And so I looked for those three motives in the lives of the 12, or at least in the lives of the authors, and for the life of me, I could not find anything that would incline me to believe that these were not reliable eyewitness accounts. And this is really what I tried to write about at length in a book that I call Cold Case Christianity. And so this book really tries to go through the entire evidence set that I looked at, looking at those four-part template that we use in jury trials. By the way, that four-part template comes from the California jury instruction for eyewitnesses. And so I really am looking at the same template to ask this question: can we trust these eyewitnesses? So given that template, I really came to the conclusion that these were reliable to the point of the miracles. And that's when I had to ask a secondary question. Jim, why is it that you stop short of the entire account? Why is it you don't think everything in there is reliable? Well, because there's miracles. Okay, well, I'm a philosophical naturalist. I knew that, and I wanted to really ask myself and be fair. So I started to ask this more important question, which is, can my philosophical naturalism explain the universe the way it is? In other words, was I warranted in being a philosophical naturalist? Or was there good reason to reject my own skepticism about the supernatural? In other words, I wanted to know, why do I reject miracles? Do I have good grounds to reject miracles? And so that's when I took a second step in the investigation. So for me, it wasn't about, well, is there God? Does God exist? And if God does exist, is Christianity true? That's kind of you can see the building blocks there you might take to get to a position of Christian theism. That wasn't my journey. My journey was exactly the opposite. I just happened to get interested in the person of Jesus, then became curious about the gospel accounts containing the information about the person of Jesus. And once I found those were reliable to a point, then I became interested in the evidence in the universe, and could my philosophical naturalism explain this evidence? And that became an even bigger issue for me, and that's the topic of my second book, which is called God's Crime Scene. So I wrote the books in the same order of my personal journey. First, through the Gospels, are they reliable? Second, should I believe the miracle parts? Because that's really an investigation about whether or not there's good reason. Can my philosophical naturalism explain the 8 pieces of evidence that are in the room of the universe? Remember, that's my paradigm for this book, is simply this. If you enter a crime scene, a death scene, for example, and you want to know if it's a murder or just a natural death or a suicide or an accident, it really comes down to one question. Can you explain everything you see in the room by staying in the room? If all the evidence you explain in that room can be explained by staying in the room, you got no evidence of an intruder. If this guy lives alone, for example, and you have everything you see in that room, from the pistol to the note to any of the other evidence in the room, can be explained without you having to go outside the room, then you've got no reason to believe there's an intruder in that room. That's probably a suicide, or that's an accidental. But that's not going to be a homicide. Once you've got reason to believe you can't explain the evidence in the room by staying inside the room, now you've got to look to the outside of the room, evidence of an intruder, and try to explain how that evidence got in the room. Well, that's a problem. And that's the problem I had as I examined the evidence in the universe. 8 pieces of evidence in the universe that everyone has to explain. The origin of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe, the origin of life in the universe, the fine-tuning and design we see in biology, consciousness, free agency, objective transcendent moral truths, and evil. Everyone has to explain how these 8 things get in the room. If you can't explain them by staying inside the natural universe, just using the stuff that's in the room, that space, time, matter, the laws of physics and chemistry that govern space, time, and matter, well, then you've got a problem. Because really, if you have to go outside the natural realm of the universe to explain the stuff that's inside the natural realm of the universe, you've got a cosmic level intruder. And what in the world would that be? Who in the world would that be? So as I examined my own naturalism and examined the 8 things that were in the room, I came to the determination that I really couldn't explain those as a naturalist. As a matter of fact, try as I might, the best and most reasonable inference pointed to something, someone, a personal being as a first cause that's non-spatial, non-temporal, non-material, that's outside the room, that is the source of all information inside the room, and the source of consciousness, free agency, objective moral truth, and evil, at least by which the standard of this being outside the room is the straight line by which we measure anything crooked. So evil even requires this objective standard of good in order to call anything truly evil. And that is where I ended up saying, okay, I think I can now go back to my investigation of the Gospels, and I don't have really good reason to reject that something miraculous could happen if this being that's responsible for all 8 things in the room of the universe actually created the universe. That being could probably pull off every miracle in the New Testament in the blink of an eye without much effort. And that's why I said, you know what, this actually is reasonable. Now we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk about what I think is the key reason why skeptics look at the resurrection claims made by the Christians they know, and they reject them. And it'll help you, I think, number one, if you are a skeptic who's still wondering if this is true, kind of work through your own skepticism. And 2, if you're trying to reach somebody who's skeptical, I think it might help you understand where they're coming from.